Is Samsung ripping us off whenever it comes to the memory, the RAM that's in our phone? Talking about the S22 Ultra we have now, looking at the S23 Ultra that's going to be announced officially in a week. So everything we've already seen the link marketing materials, we've seen the pictures, and you can actually see what the colors look like here from someone in South America who got their hands on them in retail and blasted them on the internet. So you can see that, but it's pretty well known at this point that the phones are going to come with 8 gigs of RAM for the baseline model, and for the expanded models you can get 12 gigs of RAM. This is a far cry from where we were just a couple of years ago, because the S20 Ultra, it was 12 gigs of RAM and 16 gigs of RAM. With the S21 Ultra, it was 12 gigs of RAM and 16 gigs of RAM. And I said back then, I said it was a pure and complete gimmick, that it was a sales tactic just like what Samsung is doing now with this 200 megapixel camera. Completely unnecessary. Completely not something that most people will tell a bit of difference at all. Now, there are advancements there because it's a newer sensor, new image signal processor, new smartphone system on a chip, lots of things that go together that maximize what you get, because there's a lot of post-processing and computational photography, lots of fancy words that say that the camera does half, the software does the other half, and then it makes it look really, really good. It's something Pixel mastered years ago that Samsung and Apple are still trying to catch up to. But they've done a good job. But talking about the RAM, you don't need it. So if you're worried that these new models only have 8 gigs of baseline or 12 gigs for the higher one, I've had some folks ask me, which one should I get when they come out? Whichever one fits your price range is going to work just fine. Here's the thing, and I made a video about this previously because I heavily criticized Samsung and even some other brands for these absorbent, way out of the ordinary, unnecessary amounts of RAM. It was just a selling tactic. Here's some truths. The last couple of years, the RAM technology hasn't really changed. I mean, it's still using UFS 3.1 storage. We've been using LDDR4. Not a whole lot of crazy things going on. With the new S23 Ultra, we're supposed to get UFS 4.0, which for faster transfer speeds is twice as fast as UFS 3.1, which is good. And whenever it comes to the LDDR RAM, it's going to be LDDR5 something or another. Either way, better RAM, newer RAM, all that stuff is good. But fundamentally, there haven't been a lot of changes. Not a lot of changes in the file structure, not a lot of changes in how Android works, not a lot of changes in how memory is used. And if you're not familiar with how memory is used, RAM, we got to differentiate these. Storage space and memory are not the same thing. Storage space is when you download a song, you download a picture, you download a game, you download an app and you install it onto your phone. So when you look at it and go, okay, it's got 128 gigabytes of storage, that's your internal hard drive space. That's not your memory. When you look at the 8 gigs of RAM, 12 gigs of RAM, etc., that is your RAM, random access memory. What does it do? When you open a program, it loads the program into your RAM. That's your active memory, so that way that it can call it into use instantaneously while it's using it, as opposed to continually registering it from the storage space, like from your hard drive. So it takes it from the storage, it's installed on your phone, you double tap or you tap on the icon, whatever you want to do, and then you pull it, sorry, my brain is registering computers for a second, but you tap on it to open it, and then it pulls it into your active memory, which is your RAM. That's what allows it to run so fast and smoothly without hiccups and things like that. In days of old, when we had 2 gigs of RAM, 3 gigs of RAM, 4 gigs of RAM, we ran into hiccups. Things would slow down, they would start getting clunky, and this was very evident like with the BlackBerry Key 1 when it first launched with 3 gigs of RAM. It wasn't enough. With what Android actually uses for active RAM space and what it was doing for trying to run apps and multitasking, it would start to get kind of janky and stutter some, and it would tell you that like low RAM warning and things like that. We haven't been in those days in quite a long time. In fact, 6 gigs of RAM is pretty even appropriate for most phones. But 8 gigs of RAM is perfectly fine for just about anyone. I can't really foresee anything that you're really going to need that much RAM for. And if anything, you would need more RAM now than you needed 2 years ago. Because whenever you're talking about a 200 megapixel camera that we're going to have with the S23 Ultra, yes, it uses some of your RAM space as it's processing things because it has to process a lot of data. So we need more RAM now than we needed 2-3 years ago. So 2 or 3 years ago, completely off the reservation, unnecessary. And now it seems that Samsung has opted for cost savings. And I think a lot of this has to do with availability, supply demand, and shortfalls and things like that. So I think there's a lot of market considerations that also have played an impact into that over the last 2 years. But you don't need that much RAM, because there's only so many files, there's so many apps you can run at the same time. They're going to load in active memory. Android itself uses, I think, around 1.5 gigs always, like constantly, that it's got reserved for the operating system to run. So if you've got 8 gigs of RAM, let's say you've got 6.5 to work with. The most extensive apps that are out there normally use less than a gig. And you can only run so many at a time. And then we're going to talk about another concept here with swapping, which is it's something that it kind of loads it into, it compresses it and loads it into your actual storage and offloads it to keep the memory available and keep the apps open. Anyway, maybe I won't talk about that, but just physically talking about RAM itself. When you load the app or you load the game, it loads it in the active memory. Genshin Impact, for those of you who play video games and know how intensive and how hardcore that game is, only takes up about 1.4 gigabytes. Most games are under a gigabyte. So you can only run one game at a time. Now, you can load several of them. You can load up Minecraft. I think it takes up about 800 megabytes of RAM space. You could load up Subway Surfers. I think it's 400 or 600 megabytes. You could upload, there's so many games. You could load 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 games all at once and keep them in the RAM. Like, you can open them, go to one game, and then swap over to the other one. And that's what the RAM allows you to do. It allows you to have so many different active apps at the same time. That way it's not continually reloading them. And that's what Android used to do in days gone by. What it would do is it would have it loaded, and then you would go to the menu to see which apps you have and open it, and then it would kind of refresh it and kick it back in. So it kept like a shell open. That way you could go back to it, but it wasn't actually loaded completely in the memory. Now, when it comes to the swapping, whenever you load a lot of stuff, what will happen is it'll have them actively loaded, compress them, and then offload it and put it in like a position holder on your actual storage. So that way when you swap back to it, it can pull it back into active memory quickly. And that's one thing that actually is really nice when you talk about the jump between the RAM you have and how fast the storage is. Because the faster the storage, the higher the bus speed, the faster the like all that stuff. All that stuff combined means things stay open, things open almost instantaneously, and you can do that like to infinity. You can just keep opening them and opening them and opening them and opening them. There's just so much space there. So with 8 gigabytes of RAM, that is a ton of space. Like, that is more space than you're probably ever going to hit in your lifetime as you're using the phone over the next 5 years. But when you also talk about 12 gigs of RAM, here's the other thing. If it's good enough for the Fold, it's definitely good enough for the S23 Ultra. The Fold 4 and the Fold 3, only 12 gigabytes of RAM. Not 8, but it's also a multitasking device. So when you look at things from a multitasking perspective, you want to have more RAM. So if you've got the camera open, if you've got spreadsheets open, if you're trying to use decks, if you're trying to take photos, if you want to play a game in between and you just don't want to close anything, and you don't want... See, Android is very good. It will close stuff or it will kind of fade it out in the background, and then you can just recall it when you open it back up, if you even get around to that. And that's one reason now a lot of folks say it's better to leave the apps open than to go through and close them. Used to be you would have to have special apps that would close the apps and shut down the processes in the background because they would just suck up the RAM that you didn't have. Well, now it's almost better to keep them open, if not better to keep them open, because of the way the RAM management works. It has everything shuffled and prioritized in a certain order to recall them. It actually uses up more resources to close it and reopen it than it does just to leave it there basically in the background all the time. It's just crazy the way that Android works nowadays. But, so, moral of the story is, Samsung was ripping us off. They were using extra RAM as a marketing tactic for a couple of years, and some people thought they needed 16 gigabytes of RAM, when really all they probably needed was 6 to begin with. So the fact that these only have 8 and 12, it wouldn't normally be a problem. Normally that would be perfectly acceptable and okay, except for it's a back step from where we were with the S20 and the S21 series, the Ultras, because they had 12 and 16. So you think, okay, I'm being ripped off. Yes and no. I mean, you don't need it, but it's a way that Samsung was able to backpedal, save a little bit of money, even though RAM costs them very, very little money. RAM is so cheap per gigabyte. Once you get to a certain amount, like, it's just not that big of a deal. But that's a way that Samsung and Apple always try to do things. They charge you an extra $100, $200 to go from like 128 to 256, 256 to 512, and it costs them pennies on the dollar but they use that as a way, they took away removable storage with Samsung so they can upsell you and make it where you have to pay that much more money to get the storage space because you can't add it. So that's another gimmick. But anyway, the whole moral of the story is it's plenty of RAM, 8's fine, you probably don't even need 12, but if you're going to get the extra storage space, it comes along with it. So it's kind of like, it's like a handcuff benefit that you get. But either way, your phone's going to run perfectly fine. So that's all I've got. Just wanted to unwrap some of the RAM and storage mysteries of the universe for a minute. But either way, it's going to be fine. So don't even worry about it. So that's all I've got. If you have any questions or comments, then please go to the comments section. I'll get back with you. If you found this helpful, if you liked this video, please hit the like and the subscribe button and the little notification bell if you want updates when new videos come out. And as always, thanks for being here. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you guys next time.